Again, welcome to St. Peter's, I guess St. Patrick's on the mind. St. Peter's, the Apostle Anglican Church in Kingsport, as we continue our series on Anglicanism 101, what is Anglicanism? This morning what we're going to do is we're going to break down the key players in the English Reformation from both the Roman Catholic and the Protestant side. Today we're going to look at some of the Roman Catholic figures. Again, this is like a satellite view, looking down, just covering who these people were, and hopefully it'll give us some insight as to the struggles, the battles, the discussions that were prominent at the time in fixing what became a confusing period due to Henry's break with Rome. Obviously, I'm not going to spend too much time on the more familiar names. Henry VIII, obviously the king, was probably the central figure in what most people think Anglicanism is, due to his political machinations and his desire for divorce, which created a lot of consternation in England at the time. We know that he broke with Rome. He refused, because of the refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine, and this set him up as the head of the Church of England, which at this time was significantly represented by Rome. And just stating that in reference to Henry should create some questions in your own mind, because it does create this massive power structure and this incredible battle between two highly important people at the time, the King of England and the Pope. The Pope claims to be the head of the church. Well, then what is Henry doing claiming to be the head of the Church of England, which is essentially a Roman Catholic church in Great Britain? So you can see one of the underlying tensions right from the start. We have an ecclesiastical struggle, and this is what ultimately forms the Erastian form of government that we see in the Church of England. And I'm just going to leave that with Henry. We talked a little bit about the Act of Supremacy and other important acts that Parliament produced in this time period. So let's look at the first person that to whom I want to introduce you. You may or may not have heard his name before. He's a bit obscure for those that are not wonky about the English Reformation. But his name is Reginald Pole. How many people have heard of Reginald Pole? Okay, the Anglophile has heard of Reginald Pole. P-O-L-E, Pole, as in pole vault. Reginald Pole was born on the 12th of March, 1500, right on the dot. And he died 58 years later, 17 November. He was one of the most prominent English cardinals at the time, and he was a key figure in the later stages of the English Reformation, particularly during Queen Mary's reign. He served as Archbishop of Canterbury from 1556 until his death, and he opposed Henry's reforms. Eventually, he became the final Roman Catholic to hold the position of Archbishop of Canterbury amidst all of the efforts to restore Catholicism in England. So he was the finger in the dike, if you will, from a Roman perspective. He was from a noble family. He came from the Plantagenets. And if that doesn't sound familiar, we covered it way, 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 way back. He was related through his mother to Edward IV and Richard III. So if you'll remember that time period, that was when the turn over to Rome occurred with Richard and John, two of the former Beatles. And just checking to see if you're awake. And he was educated at, pardon? Yeah. He was educated at Sheenburne Charterhouse, Magdalen College in Oxford. He, like others, he studied under William Latimer, Thomas Linacre, and later he went to Italy and he studied at Padua, financed by none other than Henry VIII. He was initially a churchman in Henry's court and was offered numerous high ecclesiastical offices by Henry if he would lend his support to the king's decrees, to the king's divorce. Pole declined, and eventually he left the country. He became increasingly critical outside of England of Henry's policies. The more Henry started to break from what would be identified more as Catholic morality than Catholic doctrine, Pole became more and more obstreperous. In 1536, he published the Defense of Unity of the Church to oppose Henry's ecclesiastical supremacy, declaring himself, this was Pole, declaring himself the son of a martyr after his mother's execution. While in exile, Pope Paul III, in 1536, made him a cardinal. And he was crucial in both early counter-Reformation efforts by Rome, as well as his participation in the Council of Trent before his death. He served as a papal legate. So he was Pope Paul III's representative. He narrowly missed being elected Pope in 1549. Well, in 1553, guess who comes to power? Mary. Pole returns to England as a papal legate, and now we see what generally is described as the restoration of the church, i.e. the Roman Catholic Church under Mary. He had his attainder reversed in 1554 and was ordained and consecrated as the Archbishop of Canterbury 2 years later. In other words, charges were pulled from Henry. They were reversed. He oversaw I'm back in New York. He oversaw, can't put an R and an R together, not with this guy. He oversaw the revival of the heresy acts, which had actually gone into disuse in most quarters. And this led to what we now know as the martyrdom of the majority of Protestant leaders under Mary. And this reinstitution earned Mary her famous moniker. Everybody remember? Bloody Mary. In 1555 to 1556, he led the term is Legantine Synod. He basically was the legate of a synod in London. And he issued the Reformatio Anglia, the Reformation of England. And he targeted abuses like clerical absenteeism, pluralism, and simony. Now, pardon me? Which one?
The last
Simony. I'm just going to mention this. I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But one of the things that we fail to remember when we talk about the Reformation in general is that we lay a lot at the feet of the Protestant reformers. Oh, you're creating upheaval. You're breaking from the church. You're doing all of these things. Bad guys. No. Well, if you actually were taking notes as we were going through, you'll recall that during this entire period, specifically from the 1200s on, Rome was involved in attempting to find ways to reform the abuses that she found. So, Reformation is essentially, at this time, a universal movement. Now, the degree to its effectiveness can be debated, but the Protestants weren't the only ones that identified difficulties. And if you look at some of the issues, there's a lot of overlap. It only becomes contentious when Luther students disseminate his 95 Theses. If that had not happened, this would have been an in-house discussion, and for all intents and purposes, we may never know. We may never have had a Reformation, because what you would have had, very simply, was an Augustinian monk raising complaints about abuses and practices within Rome, much as every other Roman prelate had been pointing out. No great dissemination of what he was articulating would have been produced, so it just would have been Luther and the church, and they may just have said, shut up and go back and teach. And we never would have heard anything else after that. But we do know that some of the things he pointed out were addressed. I mean, Luther, I don't know, we'll get into the Protestants next week, but for the most part, there were a number of complaints that Luther lodged, observations that Luther made, that were picked up by the Roman Church, not the least of which was the indulgences mess. Okay. I said more about that than I actually wanted to. So, Paul was very concerned with clerical discipline, as you can imagine. If there was moral turpitude and clerical abuse, you have a man that's staunchly defending his church. He's now going to say, nope, you guys, you need to toe the line. He reinstated Catholic practices like images and divestments, which may sound kind of shocking when you think that there was a period of time in the Church of England when Rome was popular, where there were no vestments, or at least minimal. Forerunners to your Puritan low church people. And he mandated regular catechetical instruction. Oh my Lord, making sure people knew what they believed. Heaven help us. And this was a parish. This was a parish. I'll just use the word program. But he made sure that the parishes were providing adequate catechism for its parishioners. And his focuses, for the most part, echoed the broader Catholic reform ideals that later became, for lack of a better word, institutionalized and adopted by trend. So you can see that his efforts and his work at the time was very, very significant. All that to say that his reforms were short-lived. Purists always have a very short shelf life. And he died suddenly in 1558, shortly after Mary, after her very brief reign, ended, which brought Catholic Reformation to an end, at least at this point. Remember, there was a counter-Reformation that kept going for many, 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 many years. And we will not have time to go over that, but that is equally as significant as the Protestant Reformation. Okay, we don't need to go over that. He stands out as a principled reformer, a scholar. He was an ecclesiastical diplomat, the keeper of traditions of the faith in tumultuous times, and his efforts to reinforce Catholicism in England, though brief, marked the last significant bid at countering the Protestant Reformation. There was a predecessor of his who was equally as important and as equally unknown by most, by the name of John Fisher. Fisher lived from 1469 to 1535, so you can see he overlapped the early days of Cardinal Pole. And he was one of the most prominent Roman Catholic figures to oppose Henry VIII during the English Reformation. He was the Bishop of Rochester. He was a cardinal. He was a devout Catholic who was aghast. He was mortified at Henry's break from Rome, which led to a rather ignominious death. He was born in Yorkshire, England, became Bishop of Rochester in 1504, and he became the Chancellor of Cambridge University, which is kind of interesting when you look at the history of how the English Reformation plays out, because Cambridge generally was considered the Protestant stronghold of the English Reformation. Oxford was the more Catholic, Roman Catholic. His reputation was beyond reproach. He was renowned as a theologian. He was a humanist scholar and a close friend of Desiderius Erasmus, the man that wrote In Praise of Folly, to which Luther responded. He was deeply devoted to the Catholic Church and reform within it, specifically in the sense of spiritual renewal. When we talk about reform at this time, in the bulk of the 1500s, we have to be very, very specific and very careful to define which type of reform we are addressing, because there are two different types of reform. He was involved in what was called the great matter of the time, Henry's divorce. Fisher was Catherine's most vocal supporter, probably besides Charles V. And he argued publicly in court that the marriage was valid under canon law. So you can see how this is not going to sit well with the king. Not only is he opposing the king's desire, he's doing it publicly. No backdoor, and cigar smoke, secret meetings. This was in your face. And this is one of the things, if you do study the history of this period, well, actually up until about the 1800s, the manner of dialogue that took place was acerbic. It was nasty. But they would then go out afterwards and have a pint, for the most part. But as we've already discussed, I told you what Sir Thomas More thought of Luther, and I told you what Luther thought of Sir Thomas More. This was the manner in which dialogue took place. We're offended when somebody says, "I'm sorry, ma'am, how dare you call me ma'am?" These guys were calling each other equine rectums. I want you to write that down. That's an important historical note. But you see the interaction. I mean, they were serious, and we talked about this, because for them, this wasn't a propositional matter. This wasn't something between the ears. This was life and death. The concept of Christianity, the existence of God, the involvement of the church in the life of its people, brought out serious and genuine concerns for the souls of the individual. In our pluralist society, it's like, it's okay, we're here if you want us. Come on down. You can visit anytime you want. With them, is they would hunt you down, drag you to church, and tie you to a pew, because it was the best for your soul. Okay, we're horrified when we hear that. And that's because we really don't take it as seriously as they did. And that's just a cold, hard fact. We give it lip service. The most serious, the most serious politically, even though it probably wasn't the most serious objection that Fisher laid, was his rejection of the Act of Supremacy. He completely, much as Paul, he completely rejected Henry's headship of the church. The Pope alone, according to Fisher, held such authority. There was nothing else. When the Act of Supremacy was passed by Parliament in 1534, and all of the clergy was brought forth to take the oath, Fisher stood up and refused. Again, publicly making his position very clear. He had a very important ally at this time. Anybody else? There's one guy that I'm not mentioning, you all should pretty much know if you watch English movies, if you read some books about this time period, who also was beloved by Henry, but unfortunately ran afoul of Henry because of the divorce and because of the Act of Supremacy. Anybody remember who it is?
Thomas More.
Thomas More. Fisher was very close friends with Thomas More. Well, you can imagine when you have a king that wants something as badly as Henry wanted that divorce, and you have prelates that are as equally ensconced in their theological positions, something had to give, and the prelates usually lost in those cases. Fisher was imprisoned in the Tower of London in 1534 for refusing to take the oath of the Act of Supremacy. While in prison, Pope Paul III named him a cardinal. I guess Pope Paul just like handing out red coats to everybody. Here's a red hat for you, and a red hat for you, and a red hat for you. But he was made a cardinal while he was in the Tower of London, and in June of 1535, Fisher was taken out. He was taken to Tower Hill, and he was beheaded, becoming one of the first Catholic martyrs. He is remembered as a martyr for papal authority and Catholic orthodoxy, to say nothing of Catholic unity, Roman Catholic unity. The Roman Catholic Church canonized him as a saint in 1935, alongside, who was his friend? Thomas More. And he symbolizes in his ministry the clash between royal authority and papal supremacy during the English Reformation. Okay? And last, but certainly not least, and I'm not going to go over this because she is so well known, I'm sure English children recite her life in their dreams, Mary the First. She was born in 1516 and she died in 1558. Ironically, the same year that Reginald Pole died. She was the daughter of Henry and Catherine of Aragon. And outside of all of her efforts at restoration, all of her placement of Catholic clergy within the church, outside of all of her international involvements, she is known as the executor of Protestants. Bloody Mary is the moniker that will follow her into eternity. And while I have no brief for Mary and what she did, I always find it kind of sad when the life of somebody so prominent is reduced to such an ignominious legacy. There's so much more that she had done and probably could have done. She had a better temperament, but such is the way history unfolds. All right, I'm actually going to stop and leave this time for questions. We'll deal with the Protestants next week. There are a couple of very significant, I'll tell you who they are. There are a couple of very significant Protestants that we're going to look at. We're going to look at Matthew Parker. Anybody heard of Matthew Parker? That's why I'm doing it. And two guys that you probably do or have heard, but they are important, even though Cranmer gets most of the billing. We're going to look at Nicholas Ridley and Hugh Latimer, because they are, if not the driving forces within the English Reformation, they certainly can be held up as the heart and soul because of what they did and what happened to them. So, any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I don't have anything written around my note except it's under John Fisher, spiritual renewal. That was like something he was.
Yeah, his reputation was he was a reformer in the Roman Catholic sense of reform, and his reforms focused primarily on the idea of spiritual renewal. Remember that at this point, the church had fallen into, well, just a mess. You know, priests being profligate and having ladies on the side and selling their office for money and doing really nasty stuff.
History repeating itself.
Yeah, if you want, yeah, you can say that. So Fisher was focused on straightening that out. Pole and Fisher present, if you look at them back to back, they present a very what's what I'm looking for, not light. They are two bright lights within the attempt by Rome to clean up her act, morally and spiritually. Theologically, that's going to be an ongoing battle to this day. But at the time when Rome began her efforts to reform the church, it was to straighten out the obvious mess. And there's a certain rationale to that when you think about it. You deal with the stuff that's the most obvious and the most problematic, and once you take care of that, okay, now we'll address some of this other stuff. But for right now, we've got to clean up our own house before we start talking about other people's backyards. Okay?
Could you maybe help me understand the theological reasoning behind things like the act of supremacy behind, like what, was there any theological argument that was brought to bear to say that the monarch should be the head of the church?
Yes, there is. It's long and complicated. So let me see if I can sum it up in, a couple sentences. Have you ever heard of the phrase de jure Presbyterian? All right. De jure means divine justice, or divine juror. It's in the common vernacular. It's referred to as divine right. All right. Now, we can exegetically tie ourselves in knots, making a defense of this. But usually, and I put that in scare quotes. I'm just going to talk like I'm from New York for the rest of the day. Just forget it. But scare quotes. They all go back to Deuteronomy. They all wind up eventually invoking 1 Samuel. People have not rejected you, Samuel. They've rejected me, but they morph that into well, God eventually moved forward with the concept of a king for Israel, and it was a divine choice. Therefore, we have kings that are by divine right placed where they are. That's the simplest and quickest way to understand how they were thinking at that time. This is why you have the Presbyterians doing exactly the opposite. You have us, we were de jure because of Erastianism and the manner in which the Church of England unfolded. But the divine right of kings was in many quarters within Anglicanism upheld. The Presbyterians flipped that and said, no, it isn't the crown that is the authority. It's the council, based upon all of the principles of Scripture, that are the authority. So we hold these things by divine right. So that's how the Presbyterians wound up morphing that concept into what they believe. Nothing but good? No comments on Paul Fisher or Mary Queen of Scots? Sounds like the mamas and the papas. Wow, my music
Now,
are
was
just
Paul,
dying.
was he executed or was he?
Paul died naturally. No, what was it? It wasn't the plague. It was. God, it's been so long. Don't hold me to this, but I think he got pneumonia. So, but don't hold me to that. I could be wrong. Okay. All right. Morning prayer.